Hello, everybody, and indeed, welcome to another edition of Control Alt Deluxe. We are a technology podcast sponsored and produced by Prometheus Consulting. Prometheus is a managed services and IT consulting company in Indianapolis, Indiana. Our goal with this podcast series is to educate the non-technical executive. You may be a business owner, a CFO, or other non-IT professional, and we aim to share valuable technical information in a way that you can understand to help you make better business decisions on your use of technology. So welcome. I am Tony Val, and to my left is founding and managing partner of Prometheus Consulting, Denver Abernathy. Welcome, Denver.
Thank you.
Hello. So our topic today is licensing, and I specifically asked you here, Denver, to talk about licensing as opposed to anyone else. Not that the rest of our staff is not well-versed in licensing. I think everyone is. But if I had to pick the Michael Jordan of licensing here at Prometheus Consulting, I think that would be you, Denver. So 1,000 extra credit points for you.
Well, thank you very much.
Congratulations. The reason that I was excited about this podcast is that I think that licensing is one of those things that probably no one thinks about. First of all, when they think about just IT in general, we're worried about bigger things like uptime and connectivity and security and those sorts of things. And I would also note that I think among our the networks that we access when we take over a new network, it's way more common than anyone would guess for companies to be running unlicensed software and are unaware of it. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I think it's usually not that they're unlicensed. It's usually that we'll call them under-licensed. So what we find is that they purchased a block of licenses, but maybe that was 5 years ago, and they've grown since then, and they've never really adjusted the number of licenses, and that's very common. And I think as Microsoft and others will do, they'll change the licensing requirements, and so maybe if I get a new computer, it comes with maybe a trial version that I then convert to something else, but yet I don't license it to conform to the rest of my licensing. So you get yourself into some messes that you maybe don't deserve, even because of what we'll blame Microsoft mostly, because they're the most complex and they just make it more difficult than it probably needs to be, and it's really hard to understand, and people really avoid the whole issue, and I think that's probably the biggest mistake.
I guess to be perfectly clear, let's maybe state the obvious, but just by licensing, we mean that that you have paid for your software, and from the standpoint of the software company, be it Microsoft or Adobe or whomever, you are legally using their software, correct?
That's right.
Okay, so you've paid for it. And I guess my next question, Denver, would be why should an organization really care whether or not they're correctly licensed?
Well, there are several reasons that it's important. One is that you want to be good citizens. You want to pay for the services and the products that you use. I think that's what most companies really like to do. They don't want to cheat anybody. Then there are also penalties involved. There are actual groups that have the ability, anytime you check the box and say, I agree, when you install the software or first use of that software, you are agreeing to a certain number of, we'll say, tenants in a pretty long contract that nobody reads, but within those, you're saying that you will remain compliant. You're not going to share this software with others and so forth. And so if you break that, then you can be held liable for that. So you want to make sure that you're not breaking any rules. The penalties can be stiff if you if you're caught knowingly breaking those rules. So you have to pay those, and then also just if you're out of compliance and there's an audit, you have to get compliant all at one time, as opposed to doing it over time as you should have. That's always a very large bill that can really affect your cash flow, especially if it wasn't budgeted. It can be really problematic for your whole year.
Yeah, that's one of those surprises that no one ever wants to get. Surprise! You owe a bunch of money. I want to get back to this idea of, I think, this interesting quirk in licensing where organizations are unaware that they are out of compliance. And I think oftentimes it's probably a great surprise to the business owner. Let's talk a little bit more about how can this happen? What happens to that makes people become so out of touch with their compliance in terms of the software they use?
I think it's primarily that most software will allow you to install more than what the license itself allows. So you're physically able to install sometimes unlimited number of times from a single CD, but the license agreement states that you're only allowed to install that one time for one user. So that's usually not in reality what happens. In reality, that same CD gets passed around the office and it gets installed again and again. Especially with Microsoft, we in the computer business, we usually recommend that you are in the open license program, which.
Yeah, before you get too deep into that, there's this whole element of there are different types of licenses. So let's talk about what are the different types of licenses and what do you suggest?
Okay, that can get very complicated, and it's not always, there's not one answer to that, and I think that's the reason that there are several different kinds. But we'll stick with Microsoft just because
most people have Microsoft.
Everybody uses it, and it's the most complex. Microsoft really has three major ways that you can license. They have the retail version, which is going to be the box copy. So if you go to Best Buy and you see a box of Microsoft Office and you pull it off the shelf and buy it, that is the retail version typically. And in that case, the box is the actual license. So as long as you have that box, that's the license that you need to hold on to. That is good for one computer. So it will allow you to install it and activate it on usually up to 2 computers. And there are some provisions to allow for that in some cases, depending on how you read the agreement and so forth. But in some cases, you can trick the system. You can install it on more than that. Previous versions, depending on what version you have, you might have been able to install it on many computers, and that's where people tended to get themselves into trouble. So retail version is used to be a very common way. It's a little bit less so now. Another way is the open license software program, and I think that's always has been the preferred, at least in the business arena. So it's a little bit different in that to get into that program, you have to purchase a minimum number of licenses. Usually it's 5 licenses of something to get in. Once you're in, the main benefit is that I don't have to purchase those licenses before the install necessarily. It gives me a little bit of flexibility to do my installs and then get compliant. So if once I have that piece of paper that says I own maybe 10 licenses, that's how many computers that I can install it on. So as long as I do those uninstalls and wait the prescribed time before I reinstall it on another computer, and that varies from one software package to the next, I have the ability to move those licenses around however I see fit. And so that's a big advantage to IT people. So that's the way we would normally recommend. But that's also where people get themselves into trouble. There's really nobody on a day-to-day basis counting those licenses. It'll let you install and activate, usually up to 50 times per license before any questions are asked at all.
So by then you kind of hung yourself.
That's right. If you have never purchased those, if you maybe purchased the minimum number to get in and then just kept activating and activating, you really stand to face some big penalties and certainly some catch up when it comes to getting compliant. So that's the normal place where people get into trouble. And then the third way is sometimes the remedy these days, and that's more of the subscription-based licensing, and that's either for a small business, it's maybe Office 365, which most of us have heard about, and so that just keeps you compliant all along the whole time. There's really not very many ways to cheat that system. And
of course, you're paying basically all the time as well.
Yeah, it's a perpetual payment. You have the ability to install on up to 5 devices at one time for your Microsoft Office, and of course, you can't buy everything through that. So things like server licenses, your client access licenses that many of those server products require, you can't get through Office 365.
I'm going to make a point here. So I think anyone listening to this conversation is figuring out that this is quite complex, and there are a lot of details and organization involved in licensing yourself correctly. I think about the common scenario for, let's say, an internal IT manager for a small or medium company. If we think about the world they live in, oftentimes when there's a problem that they need to tackle, maybe, whatever it is that involves loading software, where that person is thinking completely in the short term. I need to fix this problem right now to get this person up and running and going. And you can see just when you get a peek into the detail, you can see how a company's going to fall out of compliance pretty easily. It's very complex. And sometimes I marvel just around the water cooler here internally. We obviously manage the licensing for our clients, so we deal with licensing all the time. And I still see that it is challenging even for you guys that are doing it all the time.
Yeah, I'm immersed in it, if not daily, at least weekly, and I'm thrown a curveball at least once a month. There's something about the way that the licensing agreements are worded. I think they're a little bit ambiguous on purpose, and I think that really throws people. There are lots of ways that in an audit situation, Microsoft has to, and others have to come kind of get more money out of you after the fact, and I think they leave those doors open on purpose. And so you really have to know how to protect yourself along the way, and then also, if you are audited, you really don't want to go into that situation alone. You want, depending on the type of audit that you're faced with, and also kind of what stage you're in, and also kind of what state your licensing is in.
Again, complexity.
That's right. You may need some legal help, but you certainly need some IT help. You want your IT help to be versed in the licensing, and so to have a leg up, but also be able to answer those questions in the proper format.
Mm-hmm. Before we get too deep into audits, I want to take care of a little advertising, and then I do want to pick up again with audits. Control Alt Deluxe is produced and sponsored by Prometheus Consulting. We are a full-service outsourced IT solutions provider and managed services provider in Indianapolis, Indiana. If you're sufficiently scared about your own software compliance based on this conversation, feel free to contact us. We're happy to help. You can find us online at Prometheus.com. That's P like Peter, ROM like Mary, ETHIUS.com, or call us at 317-733-2388. So, Denver, you've already delved a little bit into the topic of audits. There are different types of audits, correct?
That's correct.
So let's talk about the different types and kind of how they work.
Okay, so there are really, again, in the Microsoft world, but this also applies to any software company that wishes to belong to this Small Business Alliance. And if they do belong to this alliance, and that organization is the one who decides to audit you, as opposed to any one specific company, which most of them reserve the right to do. So whether it's Adobe or Symantec or Microsoft, any of those organizations can perform their own audit, but usually they leave it to one of the other organizations, usually a trade organization, that will perform these audits. So, but if they do, they'll sometimes come in and they'll audit for all of the software packages at one time, which of course is a much bigger deal. It's really hard even for an IT group who is on top of everything to manage all of that at one time, because there's a lot of questions that are thrown your way, even with one software package audit. But when you have to do that for all of them, it can be a real challenge. The most common that we know of, or that we run across, are Microsoft-specific audits. And Microsoft has really stepped up, especially in the small business world. In the last few years, they have really made it a stated objective as part of their revenue source to go out and audit small businesses, and with really the intention of selling more licenses. And so the first thing that you normally get is it's a voluntary audit. And so they call it voluntary, but it really should not be considered when you get an email, or in some cases we've seen an actual snail mail letter that states you've been selected to do a voluntary audit for your Microsoft licensing. You really want to do that, because if you don't do it, then that puts you on a very short list to do the next level of audit, which is a much deeper dive from Microsoft, and that's usually more of a legal procedure. So that in that case, usually somebody's knocking on your door. They're coming into your facilities with usually some legal support behind them. So,
and I'm sure that people can tell that this is one of those things that if you do not address it and stay on top of it, it kind of festers, and there's kind of a snowball effect. So when we approach an organization and say, "Hey, this is gonna be a little painful, but let's do an audit ourselves to figure out where you are," we're really saving a lot of pain and expense in the future.
That's right. That's right. And what you want to do when you're fulfilling your obligations under the voluntary audit is you want to make sure that you're doing all of those things. You want to answer it honestly, but you want to make sure that you're answering it in such a way that is not leaving the door open for them to want to come in and do that deeper dive after, because that's where the penalties are usually assessed, is on that. I've never heard of someone getting out of one of those audits without some stiff fines. So usually you get out of the voluntary audit with just getting compliant. So you have to buy a lot of licenses in some cases. Hopefully, if you've stayed on top of things, we've seen several companies, even in the last year, who had to purchase 0 licenses, and then we saw some who had to really buy a significant number of licenses to get compliant because they had significant growth and didn't catch up. And so, but that's the opportunity to go ahead and do that, and as long as they do so and they can kind of prove that they did so, that's usually the opportunity to do that.
I'm going to make an argument on the topic of, can a small business audit themselves and navigate this issue themselves? Just based on this conversation, we've seen that there are many layers of complexity, different software vendors, different types of licenses, different organizations doing the audits, different levels and types of audits, different levels and types of fines. And I'm just going to sort of posit that it's not reasonable in this day and age to believe that you can navigate this yourself. You may think differently and speak up.
Well, I certainly wouldn't recommend it. You certainly could, and you could try it. I don't know that there are some tools, and generally when Microsoft, and even with the voluntary audit, Microsoft usually has 2 different methods that they'll come at you with. Sometimes they'll send you a letter, and that's all that comes with the letter. And that usually is a Microsoft employee that sends it. It's an actual Microsoft letterhead, and it's very generic, and there's almost no supporting documentation. It sounds a little bit scarier, but it also kind of some people see it as almost like a prank. And so there have been a few times where we got it very late in the process, and the first thing that we almost always do is request an extension, because
much like a tax accountant might do. Right.
There's and we don't always get the extension that we request, but a lot of times we don't get involved right away, because the way these letters come in, sometimes they even arrive in a mailbox that to a former employee. The person who's now checking that mail doesn't check it regularly, and so they don't necessarily see it as real, but they are very real. And so when we do get involved, a lot of times we have some ground to make up. So we usually have to request that extension, and that buys us a little bit of time to do some groundwork. The other one that comes in is usually through a kind of a certified subcontractor, and so those usually come with more documentation, and they seem a little bit softer almost. But what we find is that the companies behind those tend to be a little bit more insistent. They're more on top of making sure that those don't fall through the cracks.
I wonder how they're getting compensated.
Exactly. And so they're usually not as tolerant. They don't they don't take you at your word quite as easily. So they're going to come back usually with a lot more questions, because they're clearly trying to push software. So they'll really challenge your answers. And so you really, in those cases, from my experience, you want to be prepared to answer those questions, and you want to be well versed, because we've seen several occasions where they came back and tried to almost, I would say, coerce us into purchasing software that we knew that we didn't need. And if we didn't know any better, we would have gone ahead and made that purchase. And so I would say in that case, you're going to want some expert help.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really good overview, and probably kind of a deep dive into the importance of compliance in your software licensing. And again, to our listeners, hopefully we haven't scared you too much. It is kind of a scary and very detail-oriented topic, so thanks for listening. And again, if you are a business owner, a CFO, and you're just finding out about this and you really wonder, my goodness, how is our compliance looking? Reach out to someone that does this a lot. That's probably your best bet. If you happen to be in or near Indianapolis, we're happy to help you out. Again, you can find us at Prometheus.com, P like Peter, ROM like Mary, ETHIUS.com, or give us a ring, 317-733-2388. Denver Abernathy, thanks for being my guest, and you are still clearly the Michael Jordan of licensing here at Prometheus. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.